Welcome everyone to this Global Sanctions webinar. Uh, GlobalSanctions.com, for those of you that don't know, is an online provider of information about all kinds of sanctions law. We have very wide coverage of all kinds of different sanctions regimes and export controls from around the world. And you are very welcome to try it out and contact us for trial subscriptions, demos, and so on. Now, I run the site, as many of you will know, with Michael O'Kane, the senior partner of Peters and Peters, but he has unfortunately had to send his apologies. He has had to travel for work, so I will be hosting this webinar myself. And we are here, as you know, to talk about Iran and sanctions. And most of us in the world of sanctions practitioners have become very focused on Russia over the past few years. And it is refreshing in some ways to turn our attention to Iran and to remind people really what has been the history of sanctions on Iran. And we thought it was a good time now to analyze what the role of sanctions has been so far and how the recent conflict involving the US, Israel, and Iran has really brought Iran and sanctions back into the spotlight. So what we thought we would do is start by recapping and reminding everyone about the history of sanctions on Iran, about the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, that some of you will remember very well, what role sanctions have played in the situation now, and what might happen. We're aiming for an hour. Strictly, you are very welcome to answer questions, and we would appreciate that. We will try and weave them seamlessly into the discussion. And please, could you use the Q&A function to ask your questions, type them in, and we hope to be able to respond. So with me speaking at this webinar are two superb, incredibly knowledgeable speakers. Dina Esfandiari, who works for Bloomberg Economics and is their geoeconomics lead. She has worked at the International Crisis Group, the Kennedy School at Harvard, King's College London, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and is really steeped in the subject of Iran and sanctions. She's written two brilliant books, one on the UAE and one which I have here, called Triple Axis, which is about Iran's relations with Russia and China, which is highly relevant and fascinating. We're also very fortunate to have Richard Nephew, who is a senior researcher at Columbia University. He is an adjunct Bernstein Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, has written an equally superb book, which I also have here, The Art of Sanctions, which is really a must-read on sanctions policy, not just on Iran, but in particular with a focus on Iran. Richard has served in 3 US government administrations as the Deputy Special Envoy for Iran, the Principal Deputy Sanctions Coordinator at the State Department, and the Director for Iran at the National Security Council. So 2 more knowledgeable people you will not find. So before diving into the current situation, it is important, obviously, to review how we got here. UN sanctions were first imposed on Iran, I think, in 2006. And then, of course, in 2013-14, there was the Iran nuclear deal, the Joint Plan of Action, and then the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The idea was staged sanctions relief in exchange for commitments about Iran's nuclear program, with sanctions to snap back at various stages if commitments were not met. And if all had gone according to plan, I think it was October this year, the 10th anniversary of Adoption Day, when the whole UN sanctions regime was to be wrapped up. But as events unfolded, things were very different from how that had been envisaged under the deal. The United States pulled out. And Richard, starting with you, you were really on the front line of negotiations in the US government. Could you give us your take on what was supposed to happen under the deal, why it didn't, I guess, and what is the position now as regards Iran's compliance with those commitments and sanctions relief, where have recent events left us on all this?
Yeah, great. Happy to. And thanks very much again for having me. Really appreciate it. Appreciate talking with all of you. So, had we lived in an alternate universe, we would have just celebrated the 10th anniversary of the JCPOA 2 days ago, Bastille Day, for our French colleagues. And we would, as you say, be looking forward to the end of the UN sanctions regime in October, on the 18th of October, to be more specific. We would have had 10 years of very significant restrictions on Iran's nuclear program, especially on its uranium centrifuge program. That would have sharply limited its ability to get close to nuclear weapons. Those restrictions would start to ease around now, but would not really fully ease until the year 2030, at which point Iran's uranium enrichment program would basically be able to do as it wished. But enhanced international inspections of that program would continue for another 5 years. And then there were some provisions that were never going to go away, including additional access to international inspectors and Iran's commitment not to pursue nuclear weapons. So the deal, we're marking a 10th anniversary and we're marking the end of the UN sanctions regime, but we would not be marking the end of the JCPOA. The JCPOA had many more years of life to it had it continued as it was. And boy, I wish we were living in that alternate universe. I might have less white hair. So what do we have instead? In May of 2018, the United States withdrew from the JCPOA and started the reimposition of U.S. sanctions. It didn't happen all in one day, but it basically started happening within 3-4 months. And by May of 2019, the U.S. sanctions regime was effectively fully back in place. So that meant all the sanctions dealing with oil and gas, that meant all the sanctions dealing with Iranian banking, all the sanctions dealing with shipping, and all those individuals and entities that were subject to those sanctions. We can get into further details, but basically the program as it was in 2015 would be the program again as of May of 2019. It was at that point the Iranians started breaking out of their commitments. They had actually been fairly restrained for about a year. They were trying to see whether or not they could work with the Europeans to put the United States back in the box, and whether or not they could also, I think, curry some favor internationally by demonstrating that they were still trying to comply with the deal. But by May of 2019, they found it untenable, and so they started expanding their nuclear program back the way they were prior to the JPOA and the JCPOA. So we found ourselves at the end of the first Trump presidency with an Iranian nuclear program that had advanced centrifuges operating, was starting to build its stockpile of enriched uranium, all things we're trying to avoid. And then over the course of the Biden administration, things got worse. We attempted to negotiate a return to the JCPOA, and I was part of those negotiations in 2021. We were unsuccessful, in large part because the Iranians did not trust we would stick with the deal, and that might be something worth talking a little bit more. But basically it came down to that we couldn't give guarantees that the JCPOA, once re-entered, would stay re-entered. And so in the end of the Biden administration, we had an Iranian nuclear program that was significantly advanced. It was sitting about 5 to 6 days away from being able to produce its first weapons worth of highly enriched uranium, as opposed to the year that we would have had under the JCPOA. So fairly material difference. And there were lots of indications the Iranians had at least projects underway that could contribute to weaponization, although I think no one at this point is actually alleging the Iranians were in the middle of a nuclear weapons breakout. So it was much more of a threshold state sort of situation. From a sanctions perspective, just very briefly, the U.S. is still the principal country that has sanctions on Iran. Europe really doesn't. There are some sanctions on individual actors and bad guys, but by and large, this is a U.S. sanctions program that has waterfall effects onto the rest of the international community. A lot of the UN sanctions, as you had noted, Maya, have actually atrophied as according to schedule under the JCPOA, so including restrictions on missiles and things like that. But the last remaining ones are due to expire on October 18th.
And just before we turn to Dina for her perspective, is it your assessment that the US pulled out because of a view in the Trump administration that the inspections and limits regime was too lenient, or sanctions relief was too generous? or was it not really about the details of the deal? What's your feeling about that?
So it was really a cluster of reasons. I think there was always dissatisfaction with the JCPOA in some corners of the United States, especially centered in the Republican Party, but not exclusively in the Republican Party. And those concerns had to deal with the nuclear sunsets that I had talked to. There were some people who thought Iran should never have an uranium enrichment program again. There were some people who thought the inspections regime wasn't strong enough. There's some people who were really worried about sanctions regime, being ended while we still had Iran supporting terrorist groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. And then there were some folks who said, how can you do a nuclear deal and not do a missile deal? So in May of 2018, the entire approach, at least as articulated, was that we're ending the JCPOA, which is a terrible deal, to get a better deal. And we think we can do that if we had just stay the course with sanctions as opposed to backing away like those wimpy people in the Obama administration. And so when they then got 3 years of giving it a go, they found that maximum pressure sanctions weren't nearly as effective in collapsing the Iranian government and bringing it to its knees as they thought it would. I should note, though, there are still people who think that they have just had another month or two in 2021, it would have, all been success. And I think those folks are pushing against an awful lot of history that suggests otherwise. But there is still a theory among people who are of that view that getting out of the JCPOA was a good idea, who think just a little bit more time on the sanctions campaign would have achieved everything we had hoped for.
Thank you very much. And Dina, if you would like to comment on Richard's thoughts there, that would be wonderful. But in particular, we would be really interested to get your perspective on this. In particular, the role of sanctions in getting Iran to the table and getting the nuclear deal agreed. I mean, Iran is often cited as a success story for sanctions because of that. And what about the Iranian perspective, insofar as you feel able to give an Iranian perspective when the US withdrew?
Of course, happy to. And to add to Richard, thank you so much for having me. In terms of, it always makes me laugh when I hear Iran is a success story when it comes to sanctions, because I actually think it's not. I think sanctions contributed to getting Iran to the negotiating table, but it definitely wasn't the only reason why Iran came to the negotiating table. Sanctions did have an impact. Iran's economy was definitely suffering from them, but the Iranian leadership did a whole lot to mess up their own economy. So it wasn't just down to sanctions, and the mismanagement was pretty appalling. So that helped a great deal as well. And there was also this desire within the system, but more importantly within the population, and at the time, that people were tired of being in a country that was isolated. They wanted to be integrated. Iran is a predominantly young population with pretty decent access to the internet, although arguably less so now. But they could see outside what was happening in neighboring countries, what was happening in the West, and they wanted Iran to be more like that than the isolated country that it was. So I think getting Iran to the negotiating table was a package. It was a whole thing. And one other way, actually, one instance in which I think sanctions were successful is that I think sanctions are successful in getting behavioral change out of a country when their imposition is threatened and when the carrot of removing them is offered. So it's not the sanctions themselves that I think succeed in getting a state to change its behavior. I think they usually succeed in punishing a state. But I think that when you threaten to impose them or you offer the carrot of removing them, that's when the behavior change happens. And I think in this instance, this idea that the sanctions could potentially be lifted, that was floated before the last round of talks, before the 2015 deal, I think that did work to get Iran to the negotiating table. And I do think that was successful. The reason why I say Iran is is not an example of a success case for sanctions is more because of what happened afterwards. So like I said, sanctions are useful when you impose them, but they're also useful when you remove them. In Iran's case, there was a promise made, and that promise was that they would be lifted. Now, you know, we can have a debate about how comprehensive that promise was, because of course on the US side, it was never going to be a complete lifting of sanctions, but rather a temporary freeze that was just renewed over and over again. But basically, the sanctions lifting never really came in the way that would enable Iran to open up and would enable Iran to reap the benefits, the economic benefits of the JCPOA. And so in that respect, I don't think it was very successful.
And is the reason why that is so that the sanctions relief never really came, is that because the US pulled out and therefore the sanctions relief was much more on the EU side, arguably less important? Or was it because businesses never came back into Iran in the way that perhaps Iran had wanted them to? And if so, why? Or is it a complex mixture of those things and other things?
So I think it's a combination. I think the first reason is the one that I alluded to. It's that the sanctions relief that came from the US was always going to be temporary, but renewed, which meant that it was never going to be comprehensive, and you could not predict what the next administration would do. And what ended up happening was exactly what the Iranians feared, which was that when the next administration came, they were against the deal. And so the sanctions relief didn't exist anymore. In fact, the Trump administration, when he pulled out, reimposed a whole bunch of sanctions. So it was like a twofold problem. One was that the relief was not permanent. European relief was, for example, but the Europeans couldn't do that much at the end of the day because US sanctions were still in place or were temporarily removed. And then, of course, once the Trump administration came and reimposed the US sanctions, then all bets were off. And so it meant that if you were in the private sector and you were looking at the Iranian market, it was too big a risk. There was no certainty that you would be okay re-entering the Iranian market. Now, again, to caveat some of that, there's a lot of risk with entering the Iranian market, even if you remove all the sanctions. The Revolutionary Guards in Iran are very present throughout the Iranian economy. It's an opaque economic system. It's complicated to navigate. So all of that would make it difficult. But broadly, there was not even the opportunity for a lot of Western-based businesses to go back into Iran because they feared what would happen if the next administration were to not continue the temporary relief of sanctions, which is exactly what happened.
And Dina, before I ask Richard to comment, we've been asked a fascinating question, and I wonder what you make of this argument or perspective that those currently in power in Iran, and particularly those with IRGC links, are not incentivized, don't actually want sanctions removal because more open competition with the West will upset effectively their own monopolies. Do you think that's a factor or not so much?
So I think that inevitably there's an element of that. Again, the IRGC controls or plays a role in a huge chunk of the Iranian economy. So, and they do have a bit of a monopoly in different sectors, and they run things, or they at least have their hands in a lot of different pies, basically. So I think many parts of the IRGC don't necessarily want to open up because, yes, it would create competition, etc. But the flip side of that is they're also the strongest, biggest, most powerful and richest entity in Iran, which means that they would be best placed to also reap some of the benefits of the opening up of Iran. So yes, it would help small and medium-sized companies who could, potentially do a little bit more trade with the outside world. But the IRGC will be at the front line. They will be the organization that knows the Iranian economy the best. They would be able to keep some hands in some pies, even if Iran opens up and gets sanctions relief. So there is an argument that they too, because they're a part of the country would benefit from sanctions relief. And so inevitably they might benefit from it as well. You can't discount that. But it's true that I think over time, their control of the Iranian economy, their ability to profit, because they are the biggest entity and a somewhat of a quasi-monopoly in Iran, that would be eroded.
And Richard, I would love, please, for you to comment on this, and in particular on, businesses not being willing or able to go back to invest in Iran. And was there a big difference between the EU, UK based companies and US based companies once we start to see a complete divergence of sanctions policy when the US pulled out?
Yeah, happy to. And so a couple of things. I mean, first, I agree with everything Dina said. I think she's got it quite right. But I would add two additional elements to kind of why we found ourselves in a place where sanctions relief was halting. The first is just coincidence and timing. I mean, the reality was that about the time the JCPOA was entering into force, oil prices dived, and they didn't come back up for a couple of years. And the reality is, with all of the insecurities, the concerns, the risk for expropriation, which I think a lot of companies still perceive, all of those factors have to run up against a cost-benefit equation for a company, especially when they are still dealing with some residual compliance requirements too. And the math just didn't math, right? They found that oil prices were too low and the amount of actual throughput for banks wasn't going to be high enough, so banks weren't willing to take the risk. And if you don't have banks willing to take the risk, you don't have companies willing to take the risk. Just the way the corporate world works. So, you could have had foreign governments step in a little bit more with export credits and guarantees and those sorts of things. And we started to see that, I don't know, like 2017-ish. And Dina, correct my dates there. But I remember there was some discussion about European governments getting a little bit more in the game at that point. But frankly, it was too slow. It was too slow. It was too halting. It didn't pick up the speed. And then it ran smack into 2017 when Trump was saying, I'm probably going to get out of the JCPOA, basically from moment one. So, the JCPOA only really came into force in January 2016. By January 2017, it was already on life support. And it was going to be really hard based on those financial circumstances and the pressure that was being put on businesses. There was also a design element here, though, too, that's worth talking about. Dina's right. We did not have the ability to remove the sanctions that would have required going to Congress and getting statutory relief. As you can see in the Syria case right now, that is a lot easier said than done. And even there, you've got Republican majorities in the House and the Senate who are probably going to endorse the president's push on this. We did not have that in 2015 for President Obama. And so the likelihood you would not have had a JCPOA if you had instead prioritized removal of sanctions legislatively is pretty high. Now, you could say, okay, so don't do a JCPOA. I think the theory of the case was that it was worth giving it a go and seeing whether or not we could get some benefits there. But in the JCPOA as well, we did not have some of the most important sanctions. We did that intentionally. In particular, the Comprehensive Iran Sanctions Accountability and Divestment Act, or CISADA, was not part of the JCPOA, at least not the significant pieces dealing with financial institutions, their ability to do business with Iran, which meant that all those IRGC links that Dina was talking about all added a risk to foreign companies if they were looking to do business inside of Iran. They ran the risk of being denied access to the U.S. economy as well. And when I say by design, we could have put that in the JCPOA. We chose not to for two reasons. One, the JCPOA didn't cover the non-nuclear aspects, and CISADA covers non-nuclear aspects. It deals with human rights and terrorism and missiles and those sorts of things. And two, we wanted to leave something for future negotiations. But the reality is, as Dina was saying, sanctions relief is a key part of the leverage of getting to deals and part of the whole process. And if you didn't have CISADA and you didn't have the U.S. embargo, you wouldn't have had much to play with to negotiate with the Iranians in terms of support on Hezbollah or missiles or those sorts of things there too. So it was a risk that was taken to not have the JCPOA cover everything. It was also intentional. It was also legal. But the reality was it did all stymie business activities that were going inside the country. One interesting element is it did also, I think, contribute to at least some discussions of reform. Back in 2017 and 2018, you were seeing a lot of discussions in Iran about, why aren't banks coming back here? Oh, it's because of risks to the IRGC. And maybe the IRGC shouldn't be involved so much in the economy. Wouldn't that be nifty? Maybe we should have our banks be something that could get through the FATF process. Maybe that would be useful too. So there was a process of reform that potentially could have taken place, but all those things were undermined, I think, again, by the Trump administration decision to get out. And that just led to a retrenchment of all those old, tendencies. Use the IRGC to get past sanctions, use it to reinforce, what the economy can absolutely do, and then, go back to some old certainties about how you try and work with Europe and other places. Which, to conclude, you asked a little bit about European and American companies. American companies had no interest in getting into any business with Iran, even in unsanctioned areas. Boeing was the one that most explicitly could have done more business in Iran, had licenses and so forth. It was very reluctant to do so, and it was reluctant to do so for both political and economic reasons. And European companies were very worried about being sanctioned by the United States at some future point. So that combination of factors and lack of action from Europe to protect its financial institutions and its companies, that all added up to a pretty reduced amount of interest.
Well, and before I go back to Dina, just on that, what's your assessment of the EU and now UK attempts to block the enforcement of those US sanctions? So just to remind people, there was a huge divergence between US policy and EU policy on Iran once President Trump pulled out of the deal. Some attempt by the EU to try to keep the deal alive, but also legal attempts through the so-called blocking statute, blocking regulation, to try to say to EU businesses and UK businesses post-Brexit, it will be a criminal offence for you to give effect to some US extraterritorial sanctions. Do you think that had any real effect? Did that result in EU businesses not applying US policies and laws, or is it just a legally interesting but ultimately ineffective move?
I think it could have been effective, but the EU pulled its punches. I mean, the reality was the time to really move forward with blocking statute, pushback would have been the day after in May of 2018, right? That would have been the time. But instead, and I was even asking around in Europe, the year before, if the U.S. gets out, are you going to use the blocking statute to protect your businesses and companies and banks? And European governments all laughed at me. And some of the companies said, we're not even going to ask, because there's no way we're going to pick a fight with the United States. There's no way we're going to pick a fight with Trump. He's very mercurial, and we've got, more important issues going with the United States. Now, the more important issues piece, fair enough, right? I mean, there are important U.S.-European economic and political ties that go beyond the Iran issue that have to be taken into consideration. So I don't begrudge European leaders for trying to think across the whole subset of issues that they're trying to deal with. But the reality was there was an opportunity if European governments had decided to really take a stand here to try and push back, to use the blocking statute, to have reciprocal pushback on U.S. companies. Frankly, the same way we're already seeing with the tariff policy. There is an irony, actually, a little bit here, that the blocking statute essentially authorized, people on this call know much better than me, but essentially authorized you to retaliate. And that retaliation was not chosen for fear of, causing a retaliation spike with the United States. Yet here we stand, both in the end of the first Trump administration and now, with all sorts of tariff threats and whatnot coming out. So all of this, self-restraint didn't do a whole heck of a lot in terms of changing the Trump administration's perspective on things. And one can make an argument it actually helped to embolden more aggressive action by the United States.
Dina, I want to bring things a bit more into the current sphere. So between the US pulling out of the nuclear deal and the recent, what's becoming known as the 12-day war with Israel attacking Iran's nuclear facilities with US backing, what was the position before that? Because, for example, there was a recent comment piece in the Financial Times by the Iranian foreign minister, Abbas Araghi, who said that there was real progress being made in the negotiations between Iran and the US at the point just before that attack, and that in his assessment was heading to a sort of win-win in these negotiations. So what's your assessment of that? And do you think sanctions played a role in getting Iran to those negotiations?
Sure. Just before I get to that, I just wanted to add to what Richard said earlier. The US actually, because he won't say it himself, the US actually made a real effort. And you know, Richard was part, I think, of a team that came to Europe several times right after the JCPOA to really push European businesses to go invest, and we promise we won't stop you, and we encourage you to go. And you know, him and his colleagues really, really pushed hard. And I think it goes to show that it didn't matter what the US was saying. Ultimately, again, that relief was perceived to be temporary, so the risk was perceived to be too high. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we're talking about businesses, certainly businesses that have a business interest in the US. You know, the US market versus the Iran market. Yeah, Iran's market is pretty big, but like it's not comparable. And the risks in Iran are much higher. So at the end of the day, if you have to choose between the two, I think it was going to be obvious that they would choose the US. The other criticism that I would level at the Europeans, again, to go a little further than what Richard said, is that they kind of had these like blinders on in the year leading up to Trump leaving the deal, where analysts like myself were running around European capitals saying, guys, you really have to prepare for this. It's coming. It's coming. He said it's coming. He's going to do it. It looks like he's going to be elected. He is elected. He's going to do it. And European officials just refused to believe that it was going to happen. Not only did they refuse to believe it would happen, but they refused to plan for the potential that it might happen, which meant that when it happened, aside from maybe the month leading up to it, where I guess Europe woke up a little bit, when it happened, they were really taken aback. And suddenly everybody was scrambling for ideas and what do we do now? And how do we keep the JCPOA alive, etc. And I think that that's the beginning of how on this Europe became irrelevant, basically, to my great dismay as a European-based analyst. In terms of making the step from the JCPOA days to today, I think the foreign minister, there probably was a bit of truth in what the Iranian foreign minister said. I think clearly the talks were happening, and clearly there was some progress on the talks. From discussions that I was having with officials that were in the talks, it looked like the sticking point was the one that most people knew about, which was whether it was going to be zero enrichment or capped enrichment in Iran. And zero enrichment for Iran was a bit of a red line. So I think that's what the talks were predominantly stuck on. I had a Gulf Arab official who had been briefed on the matter said to me, 90% of the deal is already written and both sides have agreed to it. What's really left is just this enrichment question, which I thought was really interesting. And why did Iran return to the negotiating table? Well, for a number of reasons. And again, sanctions played a role, but I don't think they were the most important role. This Iranian desire to open up, this desire to be reintegrated, the fact that Iran had started to improve relations with neighboring countries, for example, and was working with the Gulf Arab states and was seeking Gulf Arab investment. Well, again, none of that investment could really come without sanctions relief. So there was, again, a desire to open up, a desire to get rid of these sanctions, but also the impact of sanctions were lessened because Iran had had many more years to beef up its resistance economy, because there were countries that were against what the US did. So Russia and China were much more open to dealing with Iran, which meant that some of the effect of sanctions were diluted because they weren't comprehensive like they had been prior to the JCPOA. So I think they definitely contributed to getting Iran to the negotiating table, but there was a whole range of other reasons why Iran also wanted to come to the table. There's nuclear fatigue in Iran. They were tired of dealing with this issue. They wanted it off the table. Iran wants to not just survive, it wants to progress. The government is dealing with domestic discontent, and so this was going to be one way that it could kind of temper that or get it under control. So there was a range of reasons why it was at the table.
Thank you. I want to ask both of you a question. Richard, maybe starting with you. Do you think then that the events of the last month have fundamentally undermined the effectiveness of sanctions against Iran? I'm thinking in this recent interview with Tucker Carlson, the Iranian president said that he was willing to re-enter talks with the US. But is it your assessment and particularly in light of what Dina has said, that would Iran trust the US to enter negotiations in good faith on sanctions relief, given the recent willingness of Israel and the US to use force?
So I think this is one where they would trust us more on sanctions relief than they would trust us on force, and would they trust us on Israel. And I think that goes to a very smart set of political calculations that they make in Tehran. They understand U.S. politics very well. My experience from talking to a lot of the foreign ministry folks is that they read pretty extensively U.S. press. They understand U.S. politics. I mean, that may not have always historically been true, but certainly it's been true in the last decade or so. And so they've got a pretty good understanding that if Trump wants to do something, he's got the political juice to be able to get it done. And that's both on the Republican side and probably on the Democratic side if it's a deal that is serious, right? If it passes the JCPOA's tests, and now you've got a Republican president who's supporting it, I mean, that could become a treaty relatively quickly, right? That is not the kind of thing that Obama was dealing with at the time. So from the standpoint of would sanctions relief be delivered, I think they can have some confidence there. And I think that sanctions relief can be broader. I mean, again, Trump has got more political space than Obama ever had, than Biden ever had. If Trump were to come in and say the entire U.S. embargo is going away, all the rest of these sanctions are going away, he would get some pushback. There's no doubt about that. And people would ask questions about the missile program, about human rights, about what's going on with Hezbollah and things like that. But could he get it done? My guess is yes. I think he could get enough people on board to do some pretty fundamental changes to sanctions. I think the problem that they have is they don't trust that would remain in effect because while he did do one thing, he'll do another thing the next day. I've had Iranian officials and former officials say, we see what he's doing with Canada. We see what he's doing with Mexico. He negotiates a revision of NAFTA and then he negotiates, and then he rejects that and says that's not good enough either. So they do have concerns about whether or not it would stick more than a week, but could he get something done? I think that they've got reasonable confidence on that. The problem they have now is now they don't trust that the United States can restrain Israel. And I'll be honest, I'm not sure the United States can restrain Israel. I think Israeli security decision-making has fundamentally changed after October 7th. Israeli officials are saying this, but I don't think people are listening, that they have now a zero near-term risk policy, period. So if it is something that has near-term risk, they will respond militarily against it, and they aren't really willing to absorb any criticism about it. That also means that they're prepared to accept long-term risk in order to achieve near-term no risk. I don't think that is terribly prudent myself, but that's me. I think that's not where the Israeli security system is right now. So all that adds up to, I think if you're in Iran, you're asking yourself a pretty fundamental question. We do a deal with the United States, it includes sanctions relief. It gets us everything that we want. What about 6 weeks later when the Israelis are dropping bombs? And that's part of the reason why I think the Iranians now aren't just asking for guarantees on the U.S. staying in the deal. They're asking for security guarantees. That, I think, is probably a bridge too far for Trump. I don't think he can actually get the Israelis to commit not to go. And I think he'd find that politically very difficult, in addition to persuading the Israelis would be very difficult. And a traditional security guarantee means that you will defend somebody. There is no circumstance in which the United States is defending Iran against an attack coming from Israel, at least no circumstance outside the confines of science fiction. So I think getting to a deal now with the Iranians is more complicated, ironically, even while we might be able to find solutions on sanctions and enrichment, because there's now this whole third door that's opened up that's much more convoluted and complicated.
And Dina, what do you think about the Iranian perspective in particular about now? Are further negotiations possible? Has trust completely broken down? Where do you think we've got to?
I mean, the first thing I'm going to say is I'm going to completely agree with what Richard just said. Really, I can't emphasize enough the way that Iranians think about this is they understand the US system quite well. And as Richard said, they really do believe that if anything, Trump is the president to get this done. And this is part of the reason why even today you're getting some feelers sent out in the media saying, we're willing to talk, but the conditions need to be filled, et cetera, but they are kind of saying that there does appear to be at least a willingness to continue the talks. the other thing that the Iranians are doing is I think they're watching Syria very closely. The statement that the US president made about sanctions relief for Syria is like the most comprehensive statement any, recent US president has made with regards to sanctions relief. And so they're watching really closely whether he's able to do it, how he's able to do it, how it will get implemented on the ground, whether businesses will buy it and go back in, what reconstruction in Syria is going to look like. You can't, again, I can't emphasize enough just how much Iranian officials track these things really, really closely. So they are watching that, and I think they're going to take some lessons from that. If it goes well, then, inevitably they'll think then there's a chance for it to go well for us as well. If it doesn't, then obviously it lessens even more the incentive to continue the talks. But I do think that Israel will continue to be a major problem for the Iranians, where I think for the first time, I may slightly disagree with Richard, is that I think Iranian officials, and I would agree with them on this, think that the president could hold Israel back, but there will never be the desire to do it, or there won't be a willingness to do it. I think the only country in the world that can hold Israel back right now is the United States, but I don't think the willingness is there. And so the result is the same, that you have this wild card that has now become even wilder and in Iran's eyes is completely unconstrained. And so the question is it worth us getting into talks or not, given everything that's going on? And of course, keep in mind that from Iran's perspective, they were conducting these talks. They were in the middle of negotiations, and Israel came and bombed them. So they're like, hold on a minute, we were doing the thing you wanted us to do, and you still came and bombed us. And not only did the Israelis come and bomb us, but you, the Americans, joined in and bombed us. So in their minds, it's like, well, what more do you want from us? We were talking.
Fascinating. I'll come back to some of that while we still have some time. But Dina, I wanted to ask you about the position of Russia and China in all this, because obviously the world is a very different place from when the JCPOA was being negotiated. And we've actually become pretty used to talking about the G7 being relatively united against Russia and China. But of course, back then, and this is very interestingly explained in your book, Iran was much more isolated, I guess, and Russia and China were parties to the agreement, and your book tracks the history of those relationships. So I guess two questions. One, what difference does that make to the effectiveness of sanctions on Iran? And is it your assessment that Russia and China are somehow the beneficiaries of Western sanctions on Iran, given those relationships?
So I think the first thing that I would say is that, at least in my eyes, and I think most sanction scholars would probably agree with me on this, sanctions are effective when they're comprehensive, where everybody joins in. If you have a sanctions regime that only a couple states are implementing, well, inevitably that gives the target country a whole bunch of other countries that they can turn to. And I think that's where I would put in the Russians and the Chinese. I think in the lead up to the JCPOA, whether they bought into the whole thing, that's a whole other question. But they were acting more or less in unison with the rest of the P5+1, and I'm sure Richard will confirm that. I mean, despite everything that was happening with the Russians, they were still negotiating with the other P5+1 countries, and of course, neither country wanted Iran to become a nuclear state. Nobody wanted the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and so that enabled the talks to continue. To add context to that, Iran's relationship with those two countries, it's a complicated one. I know people like to paint them as an axis, an alternative axis standing up to the Western-led order. So they might be an alternative axis, but they don't really act as like an alliance system. Their relationship is very pragmatic, it's compartmentalized, they ignore aspects they ignore issues that they can't work on together where they don't see eye to eye, and they only work on issues where they do see eye to eye together. There is a lot of mistrust. They don't like each other. The Iranians don't like the Russians don't like the Iranians, et cetera, et cetera. So it's all very uncomfortable. And of course, again, a lot of people are saying there's a great deal of disappointment in Iran now in the aftermath of the 12-day war because the Russians didn't come to Iran's aid, even though Iran came to Russia's aid in the Ukraine war. And my argument is actually, no, I think the Iranians are very pragmatic. Did they want Russia's help? Sure. I mean, I don't think they would have turned it away. Were they expecting it? Absolutely not, because that's just not what their relationship is like. So Russia and China will continue, especially in light of their perception that the problems that were created post JCPOA were US created. They will continue to work with Iran. That will continue to give Iran some breathing room. But it is not the axis, the alliance that we have a tendency to paint it out to be.
And just picking up on a point you raised earlier, is it, I think you commented that the EU and perhaps the UK are not really relevant in terms of next stages. I would be fascinated to hear your perspective on that. Is that really the reality, that this is all about the US now, and frankly what the EU and UK do doesn't matter?
Again, it pains me to say this, but I think the UK and the EU is so irrelevant that in the last couple of days they've been talking about the potential snapback mechanism, and you know, starting that and bringing snapback and reintroducing some of the sanctions. And I think literally not a single person in Tehran is paying attention to it, because they're like, well, big deal. Whether your sanctions are there or not, it doesn't make a difference, since clearly when they're not there, businesses don't pay attention anyway. What matters is the US. So yes, I do think that the Europeans and the Brits have made themselves completely irrelevant here.
Richard, what is your assessment of the damage actually done to the Iranian nuclear facilities? You know, to the facilities, to Iran's ability to enrich uranium, to weapons grade, and to develop a method of delivery, because you hear very different things from depending on which press you read.
Yeah, and even depending on the day. So the way I've started thinking about this, and I find it most useful to think about it, is there's a long-term program and then there's a short-term program, right? So long-term program are all the facilities that the Israelis and then at the end the United States attacked. So this is part of the long institutional program that, you know, the Iranians started developing back in the 90s and then really took off in the early 2000s up until today. So this is the uranium conversion facility at Esfahan that we started talking about in 2003, 2004. This is the uranium enrichment facility in Natanz that we started really talking about in 2002. This is the Fordo facility, which was originally called the Gome facility. That's how we used to refer to it back in 2009, that President Obama, President Sarkozy, and Prime Minister Brown discussed. So all of these are kind of these big infrastructure projects. Those were all severely degraded and or destroyed. I think it's the safest way to describe it. You know, it is possible that there are still some operable centrifuges at Natanz or at Fordo. The odds of that are pretty low. I think that the strikes were incredibly effective, and centrifuges are actually quite fragile. So if you introduce a lot of concussion near them, they break. So all that adds up to, I think, pretty significant damage was done to that kind of long-term big program. And people say it'll take the Iranians years to reconstruct those facilities. Yeah, that's probably true. The Arak heavy water reactor, so that's ARAK, is another facility that Iran could have used to produce weapons grade plutonium. That basically was dealt with under the JCPOA, but the Israelis dropped a bomb on it as well, just to make sure. So ultimately, that is also now denied to the Iranians. And then on top of that, there were a number of laboratories that probably would have contributed to a nuclear weapons effort if the Iranians started one. Those were also attacked by Israel, and so far as we know, huge numbers of them were destroyed. Whether or not they were intended to produce weapons and work on the weapons program, set that aside. But the physical objects themselves are no longer available from that standpoint. But that's where we come to the short-term program, and that's where I've got a lot more anxieties. So, three main elements: either we can't confirm what happened to them, or we never knew where it was in the first place. And those all could directly contribute to nuclear weapons. So the first thing is the stockpile of highly enriched uranium that everybody is talking about. And I'm glad people are. It was the thing I started talking about within like 20 minutes of the bomb starting to drop. You know, where is Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium? So I won't get into all the physics of it, but basically they've got about 400 kilograms of 60% highly enriched uranium. If you put that in bomb terms, we're talking 9 to 10, right? That material was primarily located in tunnels at Esfahan, tunnels that were not attacked by the United States other than the entrances, tunnels that were not attacked by Israel other than the entrances. And so it's possible that the material in those tunnels is inaccessible. It's also possible that you dig them out and then you're in. And by the way, there's lots of commercial satellite imagery showing bulldozers at the sites. We don't know how much material is in those tunnels, but it's a safe bet that something in the neighborhood of 5 to 6 nuclear weapons worth of highly enriched uranium was there. There was also a couple bombs worth of highly enriched uranium at Natanz and at Fordo. Again, unclear what happened to this material, but it basically, when it's in storage, imagine it in a hot water heater that's in some kind of protective case. It's not actually easy to destroy that, not nearly as easy as destroying centrifuges, because it's inert. It's just sitting there, right? And if you put it in enough protection and then there's a cave in, it's just sitting there inside dirt. So we don't know where the HEU is. Therefore, we don't know whether or not that could be used quickly to produce nuclear weapons. Now, arguably, you probably have to enrich it to 90%, which is what we notionally call weapons grade. So if they don't have any centrifuges, then we don't have a problem. This is where we go to my second factor. Iran's been stockpiling centrifuge components in secret for several years now after the production workshop that they had was attacked that started in 2021. So they've had about 4 years worth of time to build centrifuge components of their most advanced centrifuges, which are 5 to 6 times better than the machine we were dealing with in 2013 and 15. So again, won't get into the physics of it, but if you were to have, say, 3,000 or 4,000 of those centrifuges, that's the equivalent, roughly, of about 10 to 15,000 centrifuges back in 2015 timeframe. That's a lot, and you can do a lot with those centrifuges, including very quickly make that uranium weapons grade. The last thing we don't know about is Iran's ability to take uranium out of centrifuges and put it into bombs. Basically, you have to turn it to metal to do that. It's not metal in the centrifuges. People are talking a lot about this one facility at Esfahan that was destroyed that was useful or could have been useful to make uranium metal. The problem is that actually it was really big and all the machines in it were really big. But if you're going to make weapons material for, make metal for weapons, you actually don't want big machines, because if you put too much uranium in a big machine, it goes boom. So what you want to do is actually smaller scale, laboratory scale, type projects. And as some of my colleagues, especially James Acton, he's done a lot of work on this. If you want to check out some articles he's written. Basically, you can do this in a college, chemistry, laboratory. It's not actually hard to make uranium metal. And all that means is that it's possible that right now Iran has still got the ability to produce its first weapons worth of highly enriched uranium in 5 to 6 days. And so the only question is at this point whether or not Iran can get at the material, whether or not there are enough technicians around to do it, and whether or not Iran's made a decision to do it. On the first two, my fear is the answer is yes. So then it's all back down, as it always was, to a decision of the supreme leader of whether or not he wants to go to weapons or not.
Thank you for that assessment. Dina, I wanted to ask you a bit about the impact of sanctions currently on Iran before a couple of wrap-up questions. How serious do you assess the sort of negative impact on the humanitarian situation in Iran as a result of sanctions, just to bring the conversation back to sanctions? And also, are alternative payment forms to avoid the US dollar something that is seriously being developed in Iran in order to avoid some of the most stringent impact of US sanctions?
Look, it's undeniable that sanctions have had an impact on Iran. Anybody that tells you the opposite is well, I won't say what they are, but anyway. Iran's economy is struggling. It has high unemployment, high inflation. They're struggling to trade outside of their borders with anybody, but they've had many years to get used to this. And in some ways, they have. I mentioned earlier the resistance economy. I mean, this has been a driving policy point for the supreme leader. When sanctions were imposed, the Iranians felt as though like the multi-layered sanctions regime against them would never be lifted. And so Iran had to become self-sufficient. Iran had to build a resistance economy. And sanctions evasion has become a national sport, and they've had 40 years to develop their ability to contravene sanctions. And as the US continues to increasingly rely on sanctions as a tool, not just on Iran, but on other countries as well, the desire to find ways around them also increases. Again, not just in Iran, but within other countries as well. And so all of these targeted countries tend to band together and find ways around sanctions, or at least try to find new ways around sanctions. So yes, alternative payments is one of them. They've started using the Chinese currency. They're always on the lookout for new ways to do this. They've built also, I think, with the Russians, the Iranians and the Russians. I don't know if the Chinese joined on or not. I can't remember. But they built like an alternative SWIFT, for example, in order to do the messaging for some of the payments that they needed to do. And this kind of constant lookout on and constant creativity for finding ways around sanctions is going to continue. In fact, there's been a lot of discussions between the Russians and the Iranians and like sharing experiences and I guess best practices on how to contravene sanctions between the two. And this is a problem that you're going to see increasingly as the US kind of doubles down. And the reason why I insist particularly on the US is because, again, it's less of an issue for the Europeans, because I think what really matters is those third-party sanctions that the US is so good at imposing. I think the more they rely on it, because it's not like a state has that many ways to conduct foreign policy, right? It's either war, sanctions in the middle, or diplomacy. So if you don't want to do diplomacy and you don't want to do war, you're kind of stuck with sanctions. And I think that's where we are right now. With US policymaking with countries that they're not friendly with. And so the more that reliance increases, the more the effectiveness of sanctions, I think, over time are also going to diminish.
That's fascinating. And actually, I wanted to end with a question to Richard also on what you've just been talking about, which is really sanctions policy and just sort of zooming out to have a slightly wider perspective. Something that Dina has talked about is the importance of having carrots as well as sticks, if you like. So one thing that she assessed as perhaps a mark of success for sanctions is to have the carrot of removal, which was very evident in the Iran nuclear deal. Richard, your book has a very structured and helpful 6 elements of measuring effectiveness effectively of sanctions regimes. And I wonder, given Dina's comments, whether one might draw a contrast with Russia, because one thing was fascinating to know that Russia and Iran have been exchanging, ways around sanctions stories. But it occurs to me that the Russia story has so far at least had less of a diplomatic engagement than the Iranian story, at least in the sort of pre-JCPOA and perhaps pre-12-day war scenario. And I wondered what lessons you thought there could be from all this on the effectiveness of sanctions as a tool in the future, given this, both as regards Iran and Russia, obviously wildly different countries with wildly different factors at play. So is it possible to compare them when it comes to sanctions theory?
I think it is. I mean, because at the end of the day, while the countries are different, the tools are largely the same, right? There are only so many ways in which you can interfere with international commerce, and you can start small and go big. Remember, we're all talking about micro targeting back in 2014. That was the big thing. We're going after individual bonds, and that's how we're going to do sanctions from now on. And in the end, you end up going to more comprehensive, sanction solutions anyway. So I think the toolkit being narrowly defined, really where you get the distinction is everything that's around it. How you are packaging it as part of a broader policy, whether or not you understand the country in question, and then whether or not you're willing to calibrate what you're doing on the basis of what actually you're seeing. And I think those are the three hardest things to do in sanctions. And in my opinion, those are the places that we're failing in the Russia case and have failed in many other cases before. When you find that your sanctions are not working terribly well against Russia, you're not changing Russian decision making. What can you do to improve that? What are the things that you can come back to? And it seems to me that the doubling down that we've had on, for instance, the price cap dealing with oil is symptomatic of we have the perfect solution, it just needs to work better, as opposed to maybe this isn't the perfect solution, maybe there's something else that needs to go into it. And I think that the big point, and this is when I come back to something that Dina was just saying, I think one problem with sanctions policy is that, especially in the United States, we do look at it as the in-between state between diplomacy and war, but we don't think about sanctions as part of economic statecraft as opposed to just sanctions. And one of the things that we've not really mentioned here is incentives. The incentive is taking away sanctions. Okay, fine. But there's no actual positive incentive that's part of this. And if I had one wish, it would be that as part of that, sanctions policy stops taking as front and center a perspective, and it becomes put back into economic statecraft tools more general. So what would that look like in the Russia case? It would look like trying to come up with some sort of incentive package that would actually try and convince the Russians to change course. Now, by the way, I'm not actually convinced that would work. I actually think they need to be more defeated on the battlefield in order to really change their perspective. That goes back to the earlier point of embedding in a policy. But in the Iranian case, we never even contemplated the idea of expanding access from the U.S. economy into Iran, or helping them build things, or helping them, contribute to infrastructure, or any of those sorts of things. It wasn't even a discussion. And part of that is because of the U.S. economic system. We don't have state-owned enterprises, and so our ability to do kind of that sort of foreign investment directed from the government, there are institutions that do it. They're not really great. USA doesn't exist anymore, obviously. DFC has never been as effective as it might be. But I actually think that the big lesson I would take from all of these programs is to make sure they're included in the broader policy toolkit. They are not single action success stories. And that means in the Ukraine case, maybe you got to do a lot more to defeat Russia on the battlefield. In the Iran case, maybe you need to do a lot more on the incentive side to actually give real benefits there. But either way, you have to think them as part of a system, not just the one thing you do.
I want to thank you both very, very sincerely. That was absolutely fascinating. I also would like to thank those who have asked really pertinent questions. We've answered some, but not all of them by any means. But to answer one of them, this is being recorded. We will make the recording available. And I very much hope that we can continue the discussion. But thanks very, very much to our speakers. And I will now end the webinar.